The Geya G78182 is one of those watches that immediately grabs our attention. Not because it looks like a traditional luxury watch, but because it feels like someone decided to turn a mechanical watch into a miniature planetary system. From the deep blue dial to the rotating Earth and the flying wheel at 12 o'clock, there's a lot happening here. But once we get past the spectacle, there's a bigger question. Is this actually a watch worth buying? Or is it more of a conversation piece for the collection? We've already covered the full ASMR unboxing of the Geya G78182 on the channel, so we're going to skip the box and get straight into the watch itself. And honestly, the first thing that stands out when we pick it up is just how unusual the dial is. This isn't trying to look like a traditional dress watch, and it definitely isn't trying to disappear under a shirt cuff. It wants attention. When the watch is first taken out, the dial can actually look completely static. That's because the mechanical display needs to be wound before all those moving elements come alive. Once we flip out the winding lever on the case back and start turning it clockwise, the watch slowly wakes up. The balance wheel and flying wheel at 12 begin moving, and then that little Earth at 6 starts rotating as well. That moment really changes the entire character of the watch. What looked like a complicated piece of artwork suddenly becomes something that's actually moving on the wrist. Now, the dimensions are probably going to make some people hesitate. We're looking at a 46mm dial and roughly 22mm of total thickness, which sounds absolutely massive on paper. But once we actually put it on the wrist, it doesn't feel quite as intimidating as those numbers suggest. The case itself is closer to 13mm thick, and a lot of that overall height comes from the large domed crystal sitting above the case. So instead of having 22mm of solid case stacked directly on the wrist, most of that visual height comes from the crystal and the architecture underneath it. The watch still has plenty of presence, obviously, but the weight feels more spread out rather than simply sitting high and heavy on the wrist. This is still a big watch though, so we're not going to pretend it's going to work for everyone. If you prefer smaller, understated watches, this is probably going to feel excessive. But if you enjoy large statement pieces, the proportions actually make more sense once it's on the wrist. This is where the G78182 really earns its place in the Celestial series. Instead of giving us a conventional dial with a couple of hands and maybe a date window, Geya has essentially built a miniature solar system. There are two main axes crossing through the center, and each section has something different going on. At 12 o'clock, we've got the balance wheel and flying wheel spinning away, giving us the most obvious mechanical spectacle. At 9 o'clock, there's a much more subtle display showing the actual time. And that's an important detail, because with everything else happening on this dial, the time display isn't exactly the star of the show. At 3, there's a faceted crystal element that works almost like another planet, catching the light as the watch moves. Then down at 6, we've got the miniature Earth slowly rotating. Surrounding all of this is that deep blue, almost midnight-style background, with small points of light and planetary details scattered across the surface. It's busy, there's no question about it. But that's also the whole point. This isn't a watch designed around minimalism or instant readability. It's designed to give us something to look at. And this is probably the most interesting part of the whole watch. When we see that flying wheel and all those gears moving, the obvious assumption is that we're looking at a fully mechanical movement. But that's not actually what's happening. The actual timekeeping is handled by a Swiss caliber 756 quartz module, which is rated around plus or minus 0.07 seconds per day and runs on a battery that's designed to last close to 7 years. So, the part of the watch responsible for keeping time is actually quartz. The mechanical system underneath the dial has a completely different job. It's there to power the rotating Earth, the flying wheel, and the other animated elements. It's hand-wound, and once fully wound, it provides roughly 48 hours of motion. And honestly, we think this is what makes the G78182 so interesting. We're essentially getting two different systems working independently inside the same watch. One is focused on accurate timekeeping, while the other exists almost entirely for the visual experience. If you're buying this expecting a traditional mechanical watch where the movement itself is responsible for everything, that's an important distinction to understand before spending your money. Flipping the watch over gives us another little bit of personality. The caseback features an engraved astronaut and planetary design, which fits perfectly with the whole celestial theme. You'll also find the winding lever for the mechanical display, along with a recessed button for setting the time. A short press adjusts the minutes, while a longer press advances the hour. The strap takes a much quieter approach. It's a 22mm leather strap with an alligator-style embossed pattern and a branded buckle. There's nothing particularly flashy about it, and that's probably a good thing because the dial is already doing more than enough. With this much going on up front, we don't really need the strap competing for attention as well. So, after spending some time with the Geya G78182, where do we actually land on it? We think the biggest thing to understand is what you're buying. This isn't a watch we'd recommend to someone who's primarily looking for the best mechanical movement, the easiest time reading, or something practical for everyday wear. That's simply not where this watch is trying to compete. What it does offer is spectacle. The rotating Earth, the flying wheel, the layered gears, and that entire celestial presentation give it a personality that you just don't get from a conventional watch. There's definitely an obvious resemblance in the overall concept to much more expensive watches like the Jacob & Co. Astronomia, although the two are operating in very different worlds when it comes to execution and price. So we're not going to pretend the Geya is trying to replace something at that level. Instead, it's giving us a much more accessible way to experience that kind of planetary, mechanical-inspired design. And that's probably where this watch makes the most sense. If you want something that starts conversations, something unusual for the collection, or simply a watch that you can sit there and watch doing its thing, the G78182 has a lot going for it. But for everyday use, we'd think twice. It's large, it's visually busy, and the time display isn't exactly the easiest thing to read at a quick glance. This feels much more like an occasional piece that we put on when we want something different. At the end of the day, the Geya G78182 isn't really about doing one thing better than every other watch. It's about combining accurate quartz timekeeping with a mechanical display that's designed to entertain us. And if we look at it from that perspective, there's actually something pretty cool about what Geya has done here. So, would we buy it? If we're looking for a unique conversation piece for the collection, absolutely, we can see the appeal. But if we're looking for one watch to wear every single day, we'd probably spend our money somewhere else. For the right person though, this could be one of those watches that gets more interesting every time you look down at your wrist.